I waited for some other place to come out and to see what kind of reception it got, whether the book of my club selection would make any money. I waited on that before starting my next novel. The title came first before I wrote any of the text. It was just meant to be a wise-ass title, because it's not really about architecture, but the repetition of that sound, like a dog barking, in the title, Architecture of the TAOTAO. And it's about my home state, and about one of my favorite subjects. Two of my favorite subjects, architecture and country people. And I knew that this would be the history of Seymour from the beginning, from its first founders. I'd already named them in Edinburgh. Jacob and Noah Ingaloo had come so many miles from Tennessee. I had to make up the story of how they got there and what happened to them after they got there. The most challenging novel to write was probably Architecture of the TAOTAO, because I had to have not only all of the research information about the actual architecture, I had to devise a parallel between the lives of the people and the buildings that they inhabited. And worst of all, I had to keep the thing lively from beginning to end. It had to be, in a sense, my funniest novel. And it had to be clearly a novel, despite the fact that it consisted of 20 separate chapters that supposedly were devoted to architecture. Architecture was inspired by 100 Years of Solitude. It covered generations of the Ingaloo family in the same way that 100 Years covers generations of the Buendia family. It has a traveling salesman like Eli Willard, who reappears recurrently year after year. It's safe to say I could never have written architecture if I had not read 100 Years of Solitude. And I had originally ended each chapter with a list of questions for the student. 12 questions for the student of architecture. Most of these questions were brilliant, but they were mostly facetious. And eventually, Louis Harron, he loved the book even more than he did some other place, he questioned just how necessary those questions were, and I decided to take them out. It took pretty much the form I intended for it to, except, as I point out in the acknowledgement, in its original form, the novel was much more structurally explicit than it is now, replete with such language as joist, beam, stud, timber, pole, erection, rear elevation, door, gable, sill, rail, and jamb. I am very grateful to my editor, Llewellyn Hallam III, for persuading me to leave such things to the reader's imagination, and I trust the reader's imagination has succeeded. In addition to removing certain passages, he made 2 other sweeping changes of an important nature. I don't even remember what those were, but he did use the blue pencil, and so in several places where I had been too sexually explicit. He wanted me to tone it down a bit, and I was glad to comply. Then I just wrote it chapter by chapter, generation by generation, building by building, trying to cover my imagination's view of what the architecture of the Ozarks looked like. Most of those illustrations in the book, many of them are based on real buildings at Rice Creek. The mill, Jacob Engeldu's house, the general store, those were based on real Rice Creek buildings. But so many of them were just fabrications, and I mostly did the illustrations as I went along. I have always felt in teaching architecture that any building has a personality. I used to take my students on field trips. We'd go down the street and look at various houses and try to guess not anything about the inhabitants, not anything physically about the house in relation to people, but what personality did the house have. So I thought of each of the 20 buildings in architecture as having a distinct personality, beginning with the primitive, savage, uncivilized character of Fanshaw's hut, and culminating with the obscure but sophisticated double sphere of Vernon Engeldu.